Perfect timing, that perfect timing. Some pictures there of where I go to work for a living. I've got some better pictures in a minute, but as Charles said, we are one of the few brewing universities in the world. There are not many places in the world that really focus solely on brewing. We're one of them. And we're based in the middle of the United Kingdom. So Nottingham is right bang kind of in the middle of the United Kingdom. If you ever get to come and visit us, you'd be very welcome. We make very good coffee, and we'll usually find you a beer if you're visiting from a long way away. So Charles has already given me the introduction. I think one thing I would say is a lot of the material that we're going to touch on, probably it might be able to find it somewhere in books, but it's generally not derived from books or from online materials. A lot of this information is sort of handed down through brewers over generations, so from one senior brewer to the next. And I was lucky enough in my former life to be a senior brewer in what was the Bass Brewing Group and then was the Coors Brewing Group, which has a history going back well over 100 years. And I was the lead kind of technical brewer, and the previous lead technical brewer had been doing the job for 20 years. And a lot of wisdoms were passed down to me through that kind of chain. And they're not commonly found in textbooks. So hopefully there's some useful stuff there for all of you. And you've got to see quite a lot of seasons and harvests through to get these problems. And I was lucky enough to manage about 13 brew streams across Europe in terms of this technical aspect. So you see quite a few harvests, and some problems only come up every 5 or 10 years. So hopefully I can bring some of that experience to life. I'd also be really interested in the chat or afterwards. You are from a very different part of the world to me, and you may be buying materials that come from Europe, or maybe they come from Australia or other countries. So you might have different experiences, and I'm fascinated to keep in contact with people who are interested in this area and share experiences, and that way we all learn together. And that's a picture there. If you can see my mouse, that's what was the original Bass Brewery in Burton-on-Trent. Used to be the biggest brewery in Great Britain. That's the main where a lot of beer is brewed for the country of Great Britain, in Burton-on-Trent, which has historically been quite a famous brewing town. In my day job, I run a lot of courses. I run a lot of courses in apprenticeship level training, operator and apprentice level brewing. We also do everything right up to Masters of Science of Brewing, and we also run a big PhD program. And my colleagues there run PhD research groups in all sorts of things, like raw materials of the future, trying to look at beer flavor stability, which is one of those great problems that no one's quite solved yet. And my area is looking at brewery optimization and filtration particularly, but anything we can do to help breweries run better, more efficiently. What's the best processing aids? These types of questions. There's some pictures in more detail of where I work. We're lucky enough on site to have really good research facilities, and we've also got a brewery that belongs to AB InBev on site. So one of their major global research breweries, their pilot facilities, is actually on site at the university, which we gives us an amazing facility. It's a sort of $3 million or $3 or $4 million facility that gives us some great research platforms, and we have that great interplay with one of the world's largest brewing companies. But we also work with lots of other companies, Heineken, Coors, Carlsberg, and lots of smaller breweries. So like I said at the start, I think, the target audience for this talk is brewers that are at the start of their technical brewing careers. And hopefully it'll be really, really useful for people. These are what I think are the most important lessons. But hopefully those of you that are much more experienced will also find at least some of it useful or a refresher. Again, if you've got enormous experience, then please share it back with me, and then we'll all improve together. We could spend many, many hours on this sort of stuff, but I'm trying to just pick out the key points for this talk. But please, again, contact me if you wish. We're going to look at adapting to malt changes. So what happens when you get new seasons malting? What are the general things we do. We'll look a little bit at optimizing extract and the way that I would go around looking at extract and what are some real data and like what we might look at there. I want to just mention evaporation rate in boiling. In my experience, there are quite a lot of small breweries that don't focus on this, and I want to make sure that we talk about that and just share a few points of experience there. We'll look at managing diacetyl, which is a big problem specifically for the lager brewers, and how to get the best, performance on diacetyl. And we'll look at yeast cropping, flavour impacts to do with that, and then we'll finish off with beer filterability. Okay, so let's talk about a malt change. Anyone that brews for more than a year is going to experience a malt change. So every year, certainly in the northern, in my part of the world, the grain is harvested in late July through to September. And then in about November and December, so now we get the new season's malt coming through into our breweries. And every year we need to account for that. And on top of that, we will also get new varieties come out every 2 or 3 years. The varieties used change. The barley breeding companies are continually trying to get better extract, better performance for the farmer. So that leads us to get new varieties. And occasionally, one of those varieties can be problematic. Most often they're quite okay, but maybe every 5 years you'll get one that's a real problem, and you're often stuck with it because the farmers have grown it. There's not that much spare capacity, so you end up having to take some of that into your brewery quite often. So we'll look at that. It's kind of obvious, but the harvest conditions will change every year, and some key things will change. So the protein levels will change. This compound beta glucan, which is this kind of long gummy molecules that can slow down filtration, they change. And how the grain will mill changes each year. And it's worth noting, as we come into climate change, as there's more and more climate change that we have to think about, it probably gets harder. It gets more difficult. Many of the things that make a grain difficult to brew with are kind of defense mechanisms against stress, environmental stress, heavy rain, drought, etc. all require the grain to kind of protect itself. And those molecules, like beta glucans, will cause us problems. So I think those brewers that are young brewers who are going to brew for the next 30 years are going to get much more of these problems than perhaps we've had over the last 30 years. And then in extreme circumstances, particularly if you get wet harvests, we have some wet, specifically in European, those of you that take European malt, if it's a very wet harvest, you can get this phenomenon called gushing, which is where you open a can or a bottle and the beer just comes straight out the can or the bottle onto your lap without you kind of shaking it. That's gushing, often linked to molds on the outside of the malt or the barley. And then there was about 10 to 15 years ago, we had a horrendous problem where all the yeast started to flocculate out early, and that was again linked to a specific set of harvest conditions, a specific set of, certain malts were affected. So you can get malt changes are quite interesting and exciting for the brewer. So the most basic adaptation that we will make most years is we will probably have to change the main mash stand temperature. So this is the stand that's usually around 65 centigrade that breaks down the starches into sugars. Typically, an average number might be 65 degrees, 66 degrees, depending on your exact recipe. And it's very typical to need to move your mash temperature by about half a degree, up or down. And that will depend on, you look at your fermentation graphs, you look at your degree of fermentation, your apparent degree of fermentation, and you look at what level your beer finishes at in fermentation, and then you'll make an adjustment back in the brew house and maybe move things up at half a degree or down half a degree and adjust things that way. And that's a very, very common thing to do. In my experience, it's probably uncommon to need to move your mash temperature by more than a degree. So if you're starting to need to go up by 2 degrees, that would be quite weird. And I would start to scratch my head and maybe check in with a few other brewers in the neighborhood to find out what they're seeing. And it probably takes you 2 or 3 weeks to make those perfect adjustments. So usually around this time of year, by the time you get to Christmas, you might have everything back to where it was, and you've done any adjustments you need to make. Some brewers do the other way. So some brewers will keep the mash stand temperature the same, but they will move the duration of that stand. Now, and that includes some very, very famous beers do it that way. In my experience, that obviously works. There's millions and millions of hectoliters of beer made in that way. You can end up with a very, very short mash stand, sometimes less than 20 minutes. Now, I guess it's a personal opinion of mine, is I find it easier to use temperature to control fermentability of the mash stand rather than the duration of the mash stand. It just makes life simpler, in my opinion. And I'm always worried when somebody has a mash stand of, say, 20 minutes, whether that is actually enough time to complete all of the reactions and to get the proteins and things to coagulate. So whilst I can't present you with hard evidence that one way is better than another, in my experience, I find it much, much easier to use temperature rather than time. The other thing that we get from time to time, and we got a lot of this last year in Europe anyway, our malt last year was not very good due to the harvest conditions. It wasn't the maltster's fault. It was, it was the weather's fault. And the malt change will lead to slow mash filtration, and it might also link to slow beer filtration. And one of the major things we look at here is this compound I mentioned called beta-glucans. And the level of beta-glucan is a long molecule that forms kind of gums and can form gels and will generally slow down any kind of filtration process. The levels change annually. And typically you see much more of an impact on beer filtration than you will on mash filtration. So sometimes people do things in the brew house and expect to see an immediate result on, say, the Lauter ton runoff time. In my experience, the impact there can be small. The much bigger impact is 2 weeks later when it hits the beer filter. And high beta glucans can kill a beer filter, very, very quickly. Something we've been talking around for about 40 years, probably longer, is the total amount of beta glucan that you get on your malt specification can be less important than the length and shape of the molecules and what sort of treatment they've had, which is why I would always look at the homogeneity of the malt as well as just the crude number of how much beta glucan there is. And we know that a small amount of very long beta glucans is much more of a problem than the total amount if it's well broken down. So something to watch. And specifically, this can be an issue if, for example, you blend away some poor quality malt, 10% poor quality malt is mixed with 90% good malt. That can be a lot more of a problem to a brewer than if you've just got the same amount of beta glucan from one homogeneous batch of malt, one consistent batch of malt. Occasionally, and there's not a lot of research on this, but occasionally we feel that there is a sort of brother set of molecules, sometimes called arabinoxylans or xylans. They're a group of, and there's a lot of them. There's more of them by mass than there is of beta glucans. Most years, we don't believe that they are too much of an issue. Can be. I've spoken to some Australian brewers, and I imagine some of you will buy your malt from Australia. I understand some Australian brewers have suffered with xylan problems, and they've mentioned to me that it's not every year, but about 1 year in 5, approximately, there can be an issue where you get high xylans. Now, the reason that's technically difficult is you won't find xylan levels on a malt spec, and it's very rarely talked about, and it's difficult to measure, and it's something that we don't really, we don't really know if we've got the problem. But it's interesting that the most modern range of enzymes that you can buy now will typically have a xylanase side activity. So it's always worth trialing different enzymes. And if you've got a problem that isn't solved with just a straight beta-glucanase, then maybe you could try one of these more modern enzymes that has a xylanase side activity and see if that is what helps you. Okay. If you're obviously, in terms of what you can do, if you're allowed, not everyone's allowed, but if you are allowed to add enzymes, then beta-glucanase, sometimes with a xylanase side activity, can have a dramatic impact. It could double or even treble your filter run lengths. So that's something to be aware of if you're allowed to use that. If you come from the German school of brewing, then obviously you're not allowed, or you may forbid yourself from going down that route. Again, important to develop a close link with your maltster. Understand and make a long-term partnership, I think, here with your maltster, and understand what blending is happening at the maltings. Be part of that debate. Understand the germination conditions used at your malting. Be interested in that. Some brewers will insist on a 4-day germination. Other brewers don't specify that, and maltsters can germinate anywhere from 2 to 3 days to 4. Some brewers insist on 4 days, and they find that gives them greater homogeneity, greater consistency. So something you might want to discuss with your maltster. Again, it may well be different in Australia or wherever perhaps some of you may well get your malts from different countries, but this is true for the UK and for Northern Europe. And then you can go old school. So people do use a glucan stand, or a glucolytic stand is the longer word, a beta-glucan stand. It's traditional, perhaps most traditional in the Czech Republic, sort of schools of brewing, where you might mash in at 45, then raise it up to 55, and then up to 65, and then up to, say, 75, would be typical of a very old school Czech regime. It's not that common in Germany. I've worked in Germany quite a bit. And again, the Germans don't tend to need to use this glucolytic stand. It takes a long time, an increase of energy consumption, but it is there as an option if you wish to consider it. But it's not that common, I'm finding, in the large brew streams, the breweries of the world. This is just an example of what you might see down in your filter if you were to use a beta-glucanase. Is you can find that your filterability improves. This is just a graph that shows you how much filtered in a small lab filter. I have seen examples where you can see it's a little bit better, perhaps 20% better. I have seen examples where it's 100% better, double, triple. So watch out for that. And this is a simple test you can run in your own brewery. Don't be afraid to get some filter paper, find a small amount of enzyme and add it to your beer from your lagering tanks, your maturation vessels, and see how much it improves your filterability. If it's a very, very bad high level of beta-glucans, you'll see a huge difference, even with something as simple as a piece of laboratory filter paper. You could probably do it with a coffee filter. So you don't need fancy scientific methods to have a look at this if you're in a small brewery. Poor mash runoff, can often lead, if you've got a Lauter ton, if you've got poor runoff, then your Lauter ton will conduct what we would call a deep bed rake. The rakes will be lowered down to a lower point in the bed until the differential pressure changes, and then that raking will come up again. In my experience, a good or an average malt, you might get 1, perhaps 2 of those deep bed rakes in a 2.5 hour Lauter cycle time. And in a bad year, it can go up 3, 4, 5, even 6, 7 deep bed rakes. And what you've got to remember is every time you lower, those rakes are lowered, what you will find is that even if you go into a recirculation step afterwards, you will bring forward turbidity, you will bring forward solids, and all of that is going to hit your filter later on and cause you problems. So I would always be interested to log how many deep bed rakes, and then when you go to a new season's malt, check what the change is. We're now going to move on to a few slides on extract recovery. And there's lots in the textbooks on extract recovery about what numbers you should expect. I just wanted to share with you some real data from breweries I've worked in, so you've got some data points that aren't from a textbook. So I was lucky enough to work in a very large German brewery. and their extract recovery was not that good. I don't think it was, well, in this instance, their average for the year was 95.8. Back in another one of the large multinational breweries I worked in, the extract recovery on a Lauter ton was more like 97%. And then I've spent a lot of time working with big mash filters, and there it might be more typical to get something like 101 to 102% extract recovery. The differences between these numbers can be huge. In a big brewery, that might amount to 300,000-400,000 euros or dollars in difference. So what I want to do is just share with you some techniques I use to look at the differences between these different breweries. I find it's very, very useful to start by looking at the spent grain material. And there are some very simple tests. So one test you can do is just to suspend your spent grains in some water, and you can see how much additional extract will leach out of those spent grains. And there could be anything there between 0.5% to 2 or even 3% of your extract will come out from that point. And that's very indicative on deciding, whether you're using enough sparge or the speed of sparging. Obviously, if you can slow the speed of sparging down, or you can use more sparge, then you can get more extract washed out of the grain. Obviously, you have to decide at what point you stop washing the grain. Everyone's got their own specification. And if I go back a slide, that difference in sparging was the major difference between the traditional German brewery and the multinational Lauter ton brewery. The difference was in the multinational brewery, we sparged more and took the final runnings gravity down to a lower point. And the German brewery, they stopped it earlier for quality reasons. And that was the major difference between those two breweries. There is another test that's worth being aware of, where you take the spent grains and you boil them. And by boiling them, you will break open and you will gelatinize the last bits of starch, the so-called small starch granules that don't convert in the brewery as well. So by boiling it, you gelatinize that extra starch. You can then lower the temperature down to about 80 degrees and add a little bit of enzyme, which will convert that starch and solubilize it. And this is where you can find quite a lot of extract. And this is where the major difference between a Lauter ton and a mash filter exists. It's not so much in the sparge, it's in the amount of this unconverted starch. Because with a hammer mill and a mash filter, you grind it so finely, you can get deeper into that small starch granules. And that's where the major difference exists between a mash filter performance and a Lauter ton performance. And any of you using, pre-ground malt in a 2-roller mill or that sort of small scale brewing will find that it's even worse. There's a lot of unconverted starch in that type of grain. And that's just, in a small brewery, that might be just something you live with. It's not a huge issue for you, but in a very big brewery, this is a major issue. I now just want to mention something that I'm quite passionate about, is getting your boil right. I go to lots of breweries where this is not correct. And the major thing we use as brewers to control evaporation, to control a boil, is the evaporation rate. And I would expect every brewer to know what their evaporation rate was. Typically in a big brewery, historically, the minimum of evaporation rate would be about 6%. So you will boil off 6% total across a boil. And the boil might last anywhere from 45 to 90 minutes. There are some very large brands, some very famous brands where they're even higher, up to 10%. So there's quite a lot high evaporation rates out there. In my experience, I've spent a lot of time optimizing these boiling systems. You can get them down to as low as about 4.5%. But if you go much lower than that, then you really are starting to get into problems. And the main area that I'm concerned about here, there's lots going on in a boil. We can make a list of things. But the main thing I'm worried about here is what we might call removal or volatilization, the boiling off of this kind of werty character, of which DMS is part, but there's more to it than that. There's kind of vegetable aldehyde materials that we need to boil off. And that is a problem. If we were to go to a British beer festival with beers from many small breweries, we would find many beers had this underboiled characters. And it's quite common in the craft brewing scene to throw in loads of hops, but you really need to make sure that underlying beer is clean and hasn't got this worty character. But it's a very common fault. If you go off to Germany, I see Steinecker are here, and Steinecker or any of those big companies will have advanced boiling systems which will take you down much, much lower, down to 1%. And I'm sure the people from Steinecker will tell you all about that. So there are lots of modern systems out there that will get you much, much lower. But if you've got a conventional system, you can't really get down to these very low levels. I would be specifically worried about small brew houses, especially where they're using electrical elements. You can't get as much material evaporated off and get rid of as much of these volatiles if you've just got a small electrical element in the side of or even two electrical elements in the side of a tank, because they boil, and that's all they do. They boil and you get some bubbling. But if you've got one of these internal or external heat exchangers, the work comes round and round and round and hits a spreader, and you get a lot of flashing off of these materials. So it's not the same. So you need a higher evaporation rate if you've got one of these small electrical systems. Personally, I would target 7 or 8% to start with. And then clearly none of us want to burn up the planet and use too much energy. So once you've got it, you're happy with it, you can always come down. But I would start at 7, 8% evaporation and come down until you've got to the point where you're happy. Oops, I've got to jump to slide, apologies. Yeah. I now just want to mention a few things about diacetyl. For many people, this is the rate limiting step in fermentation. Diacetyl is this butterscotch compound that is specifically a problem in lager, but can also be a problem in ales. I thought it would be interesting or useful to recap on the science in a very basic way. I'm not going to draw out pathways and all of that sort of stuff. But the way it works, for those that haven't fully got into diacetyl before today, is yeast will excrete a precursor to diacetyl, and this precursor is called alpha-acetolactate. And it's part of the metabolic pathway for certain amino acids. So it's a natural compound that is excreted by the yeast. Now that precursor, that alpha-acetolactate, will spontaneously break down into diacetyl. And the rate at which it does that it's not an enzymic thing, and it's not related to specifically to yeast. It's purely a temperature and pH reaction. It's determined, the kinetics are determined by pH and temperature. And it's worth noting this is nearly always the rate limiting step. It's not. Once it's broken down to diacetyl, or once it's in diacetyl, yeast will generally take that up quite quickly. So the rate limiting step is the breakdown of the precursor, not the taking up of it by the yeast, unless the yeast is completely sort of in a really bad shape. And what we find is that it's the yeast in suspension that's important. The yeast in the bottom of the fermentation that you might want to crop is not going to take part in that reaction. So you can safely take that away. A lot of people worry about taking the yeast off early in case it impacts the diacetyl speed of diacetyl take-up. In our experience, that isn't the case. You can take that yeast off without it impacting. So that's a very, very important point to get. This is typically what a diacetyl curve looks like. So it starts off very low, and as the natural amino acids are all used up, it has to make more amino acids, so you kick out more diacetyl, and then about somewhere towards the middle of the fermentation, it peaks. It might peak at 1 or 1.5 ppm, and then it will drop down slowly until you hit a threshold. And a typical threshold is about 0.05 parts per million or 50 parts per billion. Is typically what you will see. So this is something that not many brewers seem to focus on, in my experience. But what we find is that the pH has a big impact. So in some breweries, your Wert pH coming out of the brewhouse might be 5.4. In other breweries, it might be down at 5.1. Now that difference doesn't really make that much difference to the final beer in terms of the consumer's perception, but it will make a massive difference to the speed that diacetyl is taken up. The difference between 5.4 and 5.1 probably as much, it could be more than 48 hours. And remember that when the beer is sat there and you're trying to get this VDK or this diacetyl absorbed, any yeast sat in the bottom could well be warming up. Maybe it's starting to split open. Maybe it's starting to give you off flavors. So this is a really probably the number one thing to worry about in lager brewing, or one of the most important aspects of lager brewing is getting this right. Another trick that many of you will be aware of, it's quite common, is you allow the fermentation temperature to rise at the end of the fermentation. So a typical lager, you might ferment it at 12 degrees or 15 degrees in a multinational company, and you'll let it go at 15 or 12 till about halfway, and then you might allow it to rise up another 2 or 3 degrees. And that extra rise in temperature sort of like kickstarts you through that diacetyl and gets rid of that diacetyl quicker. It's a very, very common technique used by many, many high quality brewers. It's interesting that the main flavor compounds, those esters and higher alcohols, a lot of that work is done at the beginning of the fermentation. So we find that if you do this, you don't, by allowing the temperature to rise, you don't necessarily see any changes to your esters and higher alcohols, which would generally be seen as a negative in most lager beers. So this just to expand on the point I've just made, really. It's a very, very common fault is not getting your yeast off your beer at the right time. Again, if I took you to a beer festival in the UK and we tasted lots of beers, you would find lots of them had this fault. And it's typically seen if you go to a beer festival and the beer has got no foam on it and it tastes a bit astringent, that's a classic sign that they've not taken the beer off the yeast at the right time. You get poor foam, you get sort of soapy flavors, sometimes called yeast bitten, meaty yeast bitten, and you get this astringency, like banana, like the skin of a banana type, like overstewed tea kind of astringency in the mouth. And the reason we get this is it is basically almost impossible to control the temperature of yeast in the bottom of a fermenter. Once the yeast has dropped to the bottom, it will form a great sort of lump of yeast. And that ball of yeast is very, very hard to get to, to get to temperature change across that yeast is very, very difficult. So in a large brewery, you might have several meters between the wall of the tank and the center of the yeast. And there's no way that the cooling on the outside of that wall is going to get through to the middle of that yeast. And even if that yeast was at 12 degrees when it was fermenting, when it drops to the bottom, it can easily get to 25 degrees centigrade or higher. And when it gets hot, it will spill open and die and give you, you'll get all these problems that I've just described. So my advice is as soon as you think there is sufficient yeast in the bottom of the fermenter, you should remove it. Many brewers target the middle cut of yeast. So the first small amount out of the tank we throw away, that's generally the old dead cells and some of the cold break that's settled from the brew house. Then we hit the good stuff. Many of us say it's the middle-aged cells that you want. Many of us who are middle-aged see the same in breweries. It's the young ones, the old ones are too slow and on their way out. The young brewers are too inexperienced, and it's the middle-aged brewers that do all the work. Is what I would say. Being a middle-aged brewer myself, but it's the middle-aged yeast that we want. And you'll get a mix of young and middle-aged yeasts, and that's what we want to get a really good fermentation. I'm getting some middle-aged brewers are pressing some buttons on their computers. Yes, some more. Okay, thank you for that. Lots of middle-aged people here. A useful tool is to track the pH towards the end of fermentation. So typically, I would start my fermentation at say 5.2. During fermentation, it's going to drop to about 4.1, 4.2 even, but probably about 4.1. And it should stay flat at 4.1. If I measure that and it starts to rise up, it might rise a little bit. If it rises about 0.1, probably not too worried. If it rises by 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, that's a very, very clear sign that you've got yeast autolysis and all of these problems that I've described. So useful. If you don't own a pH meter, please go out and buy one and track the end of your fermentation and make sure the pH doesn't rise. Um, Another thing linked to yeast that's not often talked about, and something we're doing a lot of research on at the moment, is filterability. So we are finding more and more links to why one strain of beer ferments differently to another strain of, one beer in the same brewery with different yeasts will filter very, very differently. And we're thinking there's a very strong correlation with yeast. And when people draw yeast cells, they often draw a little kind of oval shape, but yeast is not an oval shape. Yeast has got all of these long molecules on the outside called flocculins. They're like hairy. Think of it a bit more like a long, hairy tennis ball. And all of that hairy material will drop off and will break, or will damage filtration very, very strongly. So we're finding a very, very strong link to this at the moment with the work that we're doing. Here's some evidence on a graph I think I've got next. So here we found that ale strains filtered better than lager strains. And then we took the same strains and we stressed them. So we left them in a fermenter for another 5 days. And we found that by doing that, the filterability was noticeably worse when we stressed the yeast. And if you start to put beer through a centrifuge and you start to recycle, old yeast, then this gets much, much, much worse. And yeah, we're finding that there's this enormous variability in filter performance. Most aspects of brewing have got better over the last 20 years. We're brewing faster, we're brewing at higher gravity, but filter performance, I find across the last 20 years has got a lot worse in my experience. Can be difficult to know why. Can be difficult to know what process aids to use. So that's something we spend a lot of time thinking about and trialing for brewing companies. And when I say filter performance, this is what I would describe as good and bad. So you can see the sorts of numbers, but a good filter is going to be less than 0.2 bar per hour differential pressure increase. But there are breweries where that can be 0.5 bar or higher, 0.7 bar. Best breweries in the world probably using 50 grams per hectoliter of filter powder, maybe less, even 40 I've seen. But you can have people right up over 100 grams per hectoliter if they've got problems. And the sorts of things that I would look at here, this is a big subject, so we can't cover it in a couple of slides. But I would start by looking at the beta glucan level and type in the malt, and I would look at any associated enzymes. There's an enormous amount of filterability that is linked to beta glucans and any enzymes you might add to cope with that. And malt changes linked to that is probably the biggest impact on filterability. Another one that always shocks me is we go around brew houses, and some brew houses with big companies, names you've heard of, the beer coming out of the brew house is really cloudy. And Wert should not be cloudy coming out of a brew house. I use my wedding ring, and if I've got a pint glass and I've got my wedding ring behind it, I want to be able to see clearly my wedding ring through a pint glass of Wert coming out of a brew house. It should be bright coming out of a brew house. Unless you've got some very strange reasons for that, you should be able to get bright Wort out of a brew house. But many, many breweries, it's not. It's really, really cloudy. And that's not normal, or that is not something I would accept. Then I would start to look at yeast handling. I'd look at yeast viability. I'd look at the amount of cold break mixed in with my yeast. And am I recycling that back round in some kind of loop where it gets mixed up and broken down and goes back in again and keeps going round and round and round? We do sometimes see a link where older generation yeasts produce less filterable beers. That's quite a strong trend in some breweries. And then finally, I would make myself aware of what process aids I had to, copper finings, great believer in copper finings. It works well. There are conditioning tank finings that you can use. In the UK, historically, we used isinglass finings, which absolutely is fantastic stuff, but many people don't want to use it. But if you do use it, it is absolutely fantastic stuff. It will help your filterability a huge amount. So that's brought me to an end. I hope that was useful to some of the younger brewers. Please feel free to contact me anytime. I'm happy to chat or have emails. We could go into a lot more detail, but we haven't had time. Also very, very interested to share experiences with the experienced brewers here. It's a network. We all learn from each other. So if I can help you out, I will. And I will almost certainly learn something from you from those discussions. So please feel free to contact me. And if any of you are ever in Nottingham, please call in and we'll show you around. And that brings me to the end of my talk. So thank you very much.